Hello and welcome to Under the Superscope, where we take a look at some of the most famous games of all time and try to work out if they still hold up today. Though this time we're looking at a lesser talked about Kirby game, Kirby 64. Kirby has a habit of releasing a new game just as a console's being phased out, like with Kirby's Adventure, an NES game released in 1993, Dreamland 3, a Super Nintendo game released in 1997, and of course Kirby 64 in the year 2000. In fact, the gap between Dreamland 3 and Kirby 64 is the longest in series history. Every other installment are no more than 2 years apart, but Kirby needed a 3-year rest to fully understand how to transition to 3D. What's interesting though is in an era where you either reinvented yourself in 3D or got left behind in the handheld realm, Kirby went against the current. People often look to New Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong Country Returns as the modernization of what is the 2.5D platformer, but Kirby 64 has a lot of what those games have, only it came out a whole console generation earlier. So sit back while we figure out why Kirby doesn't suck. Well, he does. Unlike Mario, where the story always reinvents itself, Kirby has a shocking amount of continuity, where characters and elements from previous games carry over to the next. What's great though is because the story is told in such a brisk way, it's not important that you brush up on your Kirby lore, though I'm sure there's libraries full of it. But those who played Dreamland 2 and Dreamland 3 will recognise Dark Matter, which played a vital role as the antagonist of those two games. In a sense, Kirby 64 is like the end of a trilogy of subtle storytelling, although it has of course been referenced and cloned in later installments. Now I'm by no means saying that story is the point of Kirby, but it's really rewarding as a fan to see long-term consequences from game to game. Adeline even returns from Dreamland 3 with a more vital role this time around. Kirby almost always does interesting things with familiar events. Yeah, we fight Adeline in a similar way to Dreamland 3. Yeah, we fight King Dedede in his castle again. But then, Kirby 64 takes all of its familiar characters and familiar elements and puts them somewhere a little more alien. Sometimes quite literally, and sometimes in other ways. Like King Dedede, for instance, is now a full-on ally. Well, he still lobs you around, but he's pretty helpful. So let's have a playthrough and see what makes Kirby 64 stand out from a gameplay perspective. Oh yeah, you play Kirby 64 with the D-pad. Oh, so cold over here. So while Mario and Link and, I guess Donkey Kong, totally reimagine themselves to work in 3D space, Kirby 64 still very much plays by the rules of a 2D side-scroller, which was pretty crazy at the time. Rayman 1 got away with it for being released in 1995, but apart from Klonoa, which actually shares quite a lot in common with this game, being 2D on a console in the year 2000 was kind of a sin. In those days, people wanted everything in 3D, and it took another 11 years for a Kirby platformer to come to a console again. This is more than just a 2D game with 3D visuals though. Kirby 64 uses that third dimension to add further depth and variety to the world. You'll have enemies coming in from the background and diving into the foreground. You'll have boss battles that operate on different planes. And my favourite thing, the dynamic camera. I think more than any other Kirby game ever, Kirby 64 has really organic level design. If we take a peep at Star Allies, the plane you walk on has a very clear, coherent line. It works, but it looks kind of artificial. It's like everything that exists in this world must be this wide. This is how all modern Kirby games handle their plane, and the same is true for Mario side-scrollers. It's a very common trick. What Kirby 64 has though is actual paths. We usually can't see the border of a world, and when this happens, I think the side-scroller loses the stigma that it's in 2D. Like a lot of people looked at Star Allies and questioned why a side-scroller ran at 30 FPS, without really acknowledging that technically, the game's pushing the hardware in a number of ways. Kirby 64 looks the part of a 3D game, like Ocarina of Time and Mario 64. I fully believe, if the game would allow me, I could run off into the background, and this is further exemplified by the wonderful dynamic camera. This will twist and turn and show you different perspectives that few other 2D games really do. The walk to King Dedede's castle is simply tremendous as the path spirals around and you slowly get closer and closer to the gate, only for the camera to then go behind Kirby and show us the scale of this world. Tropical Freeze would revisit this concept 14 years later, but that game only ever lets the camera loose when the player doesn't have full control, like in minecart sections or when blasting through a barrel. The game did feature a full co-op mode though, so logistically it made sense, but I think Kirby 64 is one of the most believable side-scrollers out there. Even the end-of-level minigame takes full advantage of 3D, with Kirby being able to leap in a variety of directions to get different power-ups. But of course, being just a 3D Kirby game wouldn't make it stand out in 2018. Kirby 64's main new feature, beyond anything else, is the ability of combined power-ups. Star Allies revisited this premise, but they're executed in very different ways. Basically, once you've inhaled an enemy and taken their ability as per usual, you can then remove their power and hurl it at another enemy, which then combines them into something really special. That is of course granted the enemy has an ability, otherwise it will just turn into mush. So fire and needle will make a flaming bow and arrow, bomb and lightning will make an explosive light bulb, and experimenting with these abilities carries the game alone for a substantial amount of the playthrough. If you want to try out a combination, you first have to get rid of your current setup, so there's a risk-reward approach to experimentation. You can't just always have a power-up. You may be comfortable flowing through the game as a giant snowball, but then you see a new enemy that you haven't seen before, and you wonder first what they can do, and then what more they can do. There are only 7 base power-ups as a result of how many you get from mixing and matching, which is fine. The variety's great, however there's a bit of a learning curve to figuring out what enemies give you nothing at all. Like these enemies with the umbrella don't grant anything, which can be a bit deceiving given how prominent that power-up is in other Kirby games. The combination system is really excellent though, and I love how quick and fluid each transformation is. I think I may like the execution better than Star Allies. They also pack a bit more power behind them. It's not just an elemental version of the previous weapon, in some cases it's something else entirely, like heat-sinking missiles. I do think Star Allies was less tedious with the unlockables though, as many of the Crystal Shards in Kirby 64 require a specific power-up combination, and sometimes you simply just don't have it, whereas Star Allies pretty much always ensured what you need is within proximity. The game always urges you to explore though. Even from the word go, the camera's framed in a way that's trying to tantalize the left side of the screen. If you give in and try going that way, you'll find a little star. Nothing major, but it's like teaching a puppy how to sit by giving it treats. The game often uses camera framing to hint towards unlockables, but not many stages open with a 3D view like this, even though many have collectibles immediately to the left. I think this is just a way to get the player in a calmer, more collective mindset rather than the more action focus of Mario and Sonic games. And much like Mario with coins or Sonic with rings, the game also uses stars as a way to allude to secrets. You'll see stars falling into a bottomless pit, and so you may be curious, why do they go down so low? And so you chase the trail and find out, oh that's why. Every single level in Kirby 64 has its own unique setting, gimmick, and flair. It goes beyond just Grass World, Water World, Lava World, although they're certainly accounted for. Let's use level 4 from the Aqua World as an example. Prior levels already introduced swimming, and so to expand upon that, level 4 introduces a current as an immediate gimmick. We descend past 2 enemies in the background who will shoot lasers into the foreground. Because of our positioning though, these lasers will very likely miss us, and that encourages us to avoid the next one who's right bang center in the middle, because now we know exactly what he does. We're very much working against the current here, trying to avoid as many projectiles as we can. I also love how the blues get deeper and deeper the further down we go. Kind of a tangent to this, but really nice touch. Next we lose the current, but we're introduced to falling boulders that we have to avoid using precision and timing. Then in the next room, the current's back and we're being pushed through tight corridors packed with enemies, so we integrate the dodging we used in the previous screens. After a mini-boss, which again uses current, we finally get a combination of everything in the level. We're swimming through tight corridors with a current while avoiding enemies and watching out for falling boulders. A very nice, short, clever level, and this is very much the template that Kirby 64 uses throughout the entirety of its adventure. Let's look at another level. Level 1 of Neostar introduces us to these spider enemies that fall when you snap their web. Then in the next screen, we're told to climb on these vines while avoiding birds. And then we mix the two together by swinging from vine to vine while avoiding intercepting spiders. Finally, the birds, spiders, and moving platforms culminate in the swinging log segment. Watch out for the final 2 logs though, as a different coloured rope should be an indicator that something's not quite right. That level also has an interesting teaching for this one very quick hazard. We have a pair of spikes with a floating platform above them. Next to it there's a similar setup, only this time there's no spikes, but the ground where the spike should be crumbles beneath us. Now with the third iteration, the player should be very wary of the ground, as we were shown a quick hazard, given a warning, and now lo and behold, the spikes have returned. As a whole, Kirby 64 is still pretty easy, after all it is a Kirby game, but you're not littered with lives and your health carries over from one level to the next, which gives you a choice to make. Each time you clear a stage, you have a chance of grabbing some collectible intel, getting a life, or some health. You may want to fill out your enemy database, but if you only have a single bar of health left, it may make more sense to go for the maximum tomato. A single element like this stops Kirby from being mindlessly easy, and while there is a mild difficulty curve, it's never really to the point of being that challenging. In my playthrough I never received a game over, but I did inch towards my final life on a couple of occasions which adds some further stakes. I think Kirby 64 is one of the most underrated titles in the series, with its fluid combination system, excellent world design, and really intelligent level layouts. However, there are a couple of bumps. The 3D camera usually does a great job of framing the action, but in Shiver Star 3, all of these foreground layers and vertical level layouts just don't really work in this style. It was the only level that I felt got 3D wrong, and thankfully only occupies a couple of screens. Also, some power-ups are clearly just better than others. Rock and rock put together forms a giant boulder that obeys the laws of physics, but ice and ice put together forms a sentient snowball that will stop at nothing until it destroys the world. I do like how many boss battles don't give you abilities beforehand. Yeah, abilities make them easier, but they rely more on patterns and opportunities than just hacking and slashing. The game really makes great use of all of Kirby's powers, from taking abilities to hurling projectiles to even limiting how long you can float for. The only ability that didn't really get any screen time is the kick, which I don't think I ever really had to use. It's just kind of there. Kirby 64 embodies everything I love about Kirby. The relaxing, slow-paced gameplay that begs you to explore and experiment. And what better way to experiment than combining abilities? It is short, only coming in at around 3 hours, but it's excellently paced. Each level feels distinct from the last, both visually and mechanically. So is it the best Kirby game? Well, no, that's Robobot. But it is one of my favourites, and I'll always admire that in a time where 3D ruled all, Kirby had the courage to not give in to peer pressure. It also takes you to some really interesting locales, from a factory to decapitated ruins. It often feels like Kirby's exploring actual environments rather than just jumping from one bright colourful platform to the next. If you've gone all these years without trying Kirby 64, then it's never too late. Not only does it hold up, but I think it's among the best games the pink puffball has ever starred in. Is there anything that you do or don't like about Kirby 64? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more from under the Super Scope and other things gaming too. Catch you next time. Bye.